The chill in St. George's Chapel had nothing to do with the October air. It radiated from the man standing beside me, the man who was, in moments, to become my husband. I was Lady Annelise Beaumont, a name with a proud lineage, but a bankrupt treasury, sold into a gilded cage to save my family. He was Alistair Beaumont, the formidable Duke of Blackwood, a man carved from grief and shadows. As the Archbishop spoke the final words, Alistair's gloved fingers clasped mine. His touch was ice. He leaned in, and I expected a vow. Instead, a whisper, meant only for me, ghosted across my ear, a vow of a different kind. "My love," he murmured, his voice a raw wound, "died with my children's mother." The promise of a new life shattered before it even began. This is the story of a marriage that started with an ending. The year of our Lord 1838 began with the ruin of the Beaumonts of Somerset. Not the grand, ducal branch of the family, but our own lesser, though no less proud line. My father, Baron Ashworth, a man with a heart for poetry and a disastrous head for finance, had invested our entire fortune in a shipping venture that now lay at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. We were destitute. The creditors circled our beloved home, Ashworth Park, like vultures. It was in the suffocating quiet of our drawing room, the furniture already marked with auction tags, that the letter arrived. It bore the intimidating wax seal of the Duke of Blackwood, a distant cousin so far removed in status and wealth he was more myth than relation. My father's hands trembled as he read it. His face, already etched with worry, turned ashen. "He knows," my father whispered. "Alistair knows everything." The Duke's proposal was laid bare by his solicitor, a severe man named Mr. William Abernathy, who arrived 2 days later. It was not a proposal of courtship, but a contract. The Duke, a widower for 2 years, required a new duchess. He needed a mother for his 2 young children, and a respectable hostess to manage his considerable estates. In exchange for my hand, he would settle all of my father's debts, restore Ashworth Park to our family in perpetuity, and provide me with an allowance that exceeded the annual income of most landed gentry. There was no mention of affection, no pretense of romance. It was a transaction. I, Lady Annelise Beaumont, all of 19 years, was to be the price for my family's salvation. "Why me?" I asked Mr. Abernathy, my voice small in the cavernous room. "The Duke values discretion and a good name, my lady," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "The Beaumont name, even your branch, is unblemished. You are known for your quiet disposition and your education. His Grace believes you will be suitable." Suitable. The word felt like a shroud. I looked at my mother, her face a mask of quiet desperation, and my father, a broken man. I had no choice. I would be the Duchess of Blackwood. The weeks leading to the wedding were a blur of silks, fittings, and the cold, impersonal correspondence of solicitors. I never met the Duke. I saw his portrait once, a handsome man with dark, brooding eyes, and a jaw set with a firmness that bordered on cruelty. He was painted, standing beside his late wife, the celebrated beauty, Isabella de Vere. In the portrait, she was ethereal, a vision of raven hair and laughing, violet eyes. Her painted hand rested on his arm, and his gaze upon her was one of absolute adoration. The world had mourned her. She had died birthing their second child, a son, and her death had reportedly shattered the Duke, transforming him from a charismatic society figure into a recluse. I was not just marrying a widower. I was marrying a man still shackled to a ghost. Our wedding day was a sombre affair at St. George's Chapel in Hanover Square. It was a private ceremony, attended only by my parents and the Duke's solicitor. The groom was a stranger, When I saw him standing at the altar, he was more formidable than his portrait. Taller, broader, his presence filled the sacred space with a palpable aura of grief. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were hollowed out, dark circles beneath them telling of sleepless nights. He did not look at me as I walked down the aisle, his gaze fixed on the stained glass window as if searching for an apparition. I stood beside him, a stranger in a dress of ivory silk he had paid for. I could feel the cold emanating from him. When the moment came to take my hand, his touch was hesitant, fleeting, as if touching me was a betrayal. His fingers were like ice against my skin. Then came the moment that would define the rest of my life. As the Archbishop pronounced us man and wife, Alistair, Duke of Blackwood, my husband, leaned toward me. For a foolish, fleeting second, my heart leapt, thinking he might offer a word of comfort, of welcome. Instead, his voice, a low, guttural murmur meant only for my ears, delivered the killing blow. "My love," he breathed, the words laced with an agony so profound it stole the air from my lungs. "Died with my children's mother." He straightened up, his face an unreadable mask of granite. The solicitor cleared his throat. My parents looked on with anxious, hopeful faces. They hadn't heard. No one had heard but me. In the solemn silence of God's house, my husband had not made a vow to me, but to the memory of the woman I was meant to replace. I was the Duchess of Blackwood, and my marriage was over before it had even begun. The contract was signed, the price was paid, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The journey to Blackwood Manor, the Duke's ancestral seat in the heart of Derbyshire, was conducted in near complete silence. We sat opposite each other in the cavernous, well-sprung carriage, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves, the only sound between us. Alistair stared out the window, his profile etched against the rolling green hills, a statue of impenetrable sorrow. He never once looked at me. I was a piece of cargo he was transporting, a necessary acquisition he already regretted. As we passed through the great iron gates, flanked by snarling stone wolves, the sheer scale of my new life became apparent. Blackwood Manor was not a house. It was a fortress of grey stone, ancient and imposing, its mullioned windows like 100 vacant eyes staring out over a perfectly manicured but lifeless park. The staff was assembled in the grand entrance hall, a sea of black and white uniforms standing before a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. A stern, white-haired woman with a ramrod-straight spine stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth as she curtsied. "Welcome home." Her eyes flickered towards me for a brief, dismissive moment. "My lady." This was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, and it was clear her loyalty lay with the previous administration. "Gable," Alistair acknowledged with a curt nod. "Her Grace will be taking the Angeline suite." A faint, almost imperceptible gasp rippled through the staff. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned. "Your Grace, but that is—" "The Duchess's chambers are not to be disturbed," he cut in, his voice like the crack of a whip. "Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." My blood ran cold. The Duchess's chambers, Isabella's rooms, were to remain a shrine. I was being installed in a guest wing, a visitor in my own home. Mrs. Gable led me up a sweeping marble staircase, my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. We passed countless portraits of stern-faced Beaumont ancestors, but my eyes were drawn to one painting in particular, which hung at the top of the stairs. It was a life-sized portrait of Isabella. She was depicted in a garden, sunlight catching in her dark hair, a genuine incandescent smile on her face. She was breathtakingly beautiful, vibrantly alive, even in oil and canvas. Standing beneath it, I felt like a pale, smudged charcoal sketch. The late Duchess was a remarkable woman, Mrs. Gable said, her voice softening for the first time. The heart of this house. We all miss her terribly. The implication was clear. You can never replace her. My rooms, the Angelini suite, were opulent and beautifully appointed, but they felt sterile, lacking any personal touch. That evening, I dined alone in a breakfast room that could have seated 20. The Duke, I was informed by a footman, had taken his meal in his study. The next morning, I was told the children would be presented to me in the nursery after their lessons. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were the one part of this bargain that felt real, the one part that held a flicker of potential warmth. I wanted to be a good mother to them. I found them in a large, sun-filled room at the top of the house. A girl of about 7, with her father's stormy eyes and her mother's raven hair, stood stiffly beside her governess. The boy, a toddler of perhaps 2, sat on the floor, stacking wooden blocks. "Children," the governess, Miss Albright, said with a strained smile, "this is your new mother, the Duchess." The little boy, Thomas, looked up at me with wide, curious blue eyes and gave me a hesitant, gummy smile. But the girl's gaze was pure ice. "Her name is Lady Annelise," she stated, her voice unnervingly adult. "My mother was the Duchess." I knelt down, trying to soften my expression. "You must be Alara." "Lady Alara," she corrected me sharply. "Lady Alara," I amended, my smile faltering. "It is a pleasure to meet you, and you must be Thomas." I reached a hand towards the little boy, but Alara moved with surprising speed, stepping between us. "Don't touch him. You are not our mother. You are just the lady Papa brought here." The venom in her words was a physical blow. She was a child, a grieving child, I reminded myself. But her loyalty was a fortress, and I was the invading army. Miss Albright looked mortified, but said nothing to correct her charge. It was then I realized that the entire household was an extension of the Duke's grief. They were all guardians of Isabella's memory, and I was an unwelcome usurper. The days that followed fell into a monotonous, lonely pattern. I explored the manor, my footsteps echoing in the silent, gilded halls. Every room was a testament to Isabella. Her sheet music still sat on the pianoforte in the music room. Her favorite shawl was draped over a chair in the morning room. Her scent, a faint, lingering perfume of lavender and roses, seemed to be infused into the very walls. I was living in a mausoleum, haunted by the ghost of a perfect wife. My husband remained a phantom. We saw each other only at dinner, a torturously formal affair in the cavernous dining hall, separated by what felt like a mile of polished mahogany. We spoke of the weather, of estate matters, of anything and everything that was impersonal and safe. He never asked about my day, my thoughts, my feelings. His eyes would often drift to the portrait of Isabella that hung over the mantelpiece, and I knew that in those moments I ceased to exist for him. One evening, desperate to shatter the suffocating silence, I said, "The gardens are lovely. I was thinking I might restore the old rose garden by the south terrace." Alistair's fork stilled. A shadow crossed his face. "That was my wife's garden," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You will leave it be." He didn't say Isabella. He said my wife. The distinction was a knife to the heart. There was only one wife, one Duchess, in his mind. I was merely a placeholder, a legal necessity with no right to touch the sacred relics of his past. That night, I cried myself to sleep for the first time since my arrival, the fine linen sheets of my guest bed feeling as cold and unforgiving as a tomb. Weeks bled into a month. I established a routine, a fragile armor against the loneliness. I would walk the grounds, carefully avoiding Isabella's rose garden, and spend my afternoons in the vast library, losing myself in books because the world within their pages was far more welcoming than my own. My attempts to connect with the children were met with a wall of resistance, expertly marshalled by Ilara. If I tried to read to them, Ilara would announce it was time for their nap. If I offered Thomas a sweet, Ilara would snatch it away, declaring it would spoil his supper. Thomas, a naturally sunny-tempered child, would look at me with confused eyes, his instinct to be friendly warring with his sister's fierce command. Alistair remained a distant, brooding presence. He spent his days locked in his study or riding across the estate, managing the vast Blackwood holdings with a relentless efficiency that seemed to be his only escape from his thoughts. He was a good duke, a responsible landlord, but he was not a husband. He was a housemate, bound to me by law. The first crack in the icy facade of our lives came not from within, but from without. A letter arrived, announcing the impending visit of Lord Julian Croft. Lord Croft? I inquired over dinner, the name unfamiliar to me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than grief in Alistair's eyes. It looked like irritation. "He is Isabella's cousin," he said curtly. "He comes every year around this time, to mark the anniversary of her passing." Another ritual in the cult of Isabella. I steeled myself for the arrival of another mourner who would surely judge me and find me wanting. Lord Julian Croft was the opposite of what I expected. Where Alistair was dark and severe, Julian was fair and charming. He arrived with a disarming smile, his fashionable London attire a stark contrast to the sombre mood of Blackwood. "Your Grace," he said, bowing low over my hand, his blue eyes twinkling. "The new Duchess of Blackwood. A pleasure beyond words. Alistair, you old brute, you did not tell me you had married such a vision." Alistair's only response was a tight-lipped grunt. Julian's presence was like a sudden, jarring burst of sunlight in a crypt. He filled the silent dining room with witty anecdotes about society, complimenting the food, the wine, and me. He had a way of looking at me, a focused, appreciative gaze that was so different from my husband's perpetual indifference. It was unnerving, yet I found myself grateful for the simple human warmth. He spoke of Isabella often, but his stories were different from the hallowed whispers of the staff. He told of her mischief, her sharp wit, her love of dancing. "She was no plaster saint, my Bella," he said with a laugh, raising his glass. "She was fire and lightning. She would have hated all this gloom." Alistair's knuckles were white where he gripped his wine glass. "That is enough, Julian." "Nonsense," Julian replied smoothly, turning his smile on me. "The new Duchess deserves to know the woman, not just the myth." Over the next few days, Julian made himself a constant companion. He sought me out in the library, walked with me in the gardens, making a great show of lamenting the state of Isabella's precious roses, and made a concerted effort to charm the children. Ilara, to my astonishment, seemed captivated by him. He was Uncle Julian, the one who brought her expensive dolls from London and told her stories about her angel mother. Yet there was something about him that set my teeth on edge. His charm felt practiced, his compliments a little too smooth. He would ask subtle, probing questions about my marriage, about Alistair, his eyes gleaming with an unreadable curiosity. The turning point came one stormy night. I was awoken by a frantic knock on my door. It was Miss Albright, her face pale with panic. "It's Master Thomas, Your Grace. He's burning with fever, and he's crying for his mother." I didn't hesitate. I threw on a dressing gown and ran to the nursery. The small room was filled with the sound of Thomas's weak, rasping cries. Ilara stood by the window, a small, terrified sentinel. Alistair was already there, pacing the floor like a caged beast, his face a mask of raw fear. The local doctor had been sent for, but the storm was slowing his progress. Thomas was thrashing in his cot, his little body slick with sweat. "Mama!" he sobbed, his eyes glassy with fever. "Want Mama." Alistair froze, his own pain so profound it seemed to paralyze him. He looked from his suffering son to the portrait of Isabella that hung, of course, even in the nursery. In that moment, I ceased to be the replacement, the interloper. I was simply a woman seeing a child in distress. I pushed past the Duke, dipped a cloth in a bowl of cool water, and began to bathe Thomas's forehead. "Hush now, little one," I murmured, my voice soft. "Hush now. I am here." I began to hum a simple lullaby, one my own mother had sung to me. It was a tune of comfort, of home. Thomas's cries began to subside, his fevered gaze focusing on my face. He was still calling for his mother, but he allowed my touch, leaning into the coolness of the cloth. I sat there for what felt like hours, humming and tending to him, the Duke, a silent, unmoving statue in the corner of the room. When the doctor finally arrived, Thomas's fever had begun to break. He was sleeping, his small hand wrapped tightly around my finger. The doctor administered a draught and assured us the worst was over. As he left, Alistair finally moved. He walked to the side of the cot, his gaze falling not on his sleeping son, but on our joined hands. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time since I had arrived at Blackwood. His stormy eyes were no longer hollow, but filled with a complex mixture of gratitude, confusion, and something else I couldn't name. "Thank you," he said. The two words were quiet, almost rough, as if they were foreign to his tongue. He didn't leave. He pulled up a chair and sat beside me, and together, in the dim, pre-dawn light, we kept vigil over our son. For the first time, in the shared space of a child's sick room, we were not the Duke and his contracted Duchess. We were simply a father and a mother. A fragile truce had been called in the silent halls of Blackwood. The truce born in the nursery was a delicate thing. Alistair was no longer openly hostile. A quiet, watchful courtesy had replaced his cold indifference. We began to speak at dinner, our conversations expanding beyond the weather to include the children, estate business, even on one occasion, a book I was reading. It was a fragile bridge, but it was a start. Thomas, since his illness, had become my little shadow, following me through the gardens and demanding stories. Even Ilara's icy disdain had thawed to a grudging neutrality. She would watch me with her father's intense, stormy eyes, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Lord Julian Croft had departed the day after Thomas's recovery, his charming facade briefly cracking to reveal a flash of annoyance that the household's attention was no longer on him or the memory of Isabella. "Do take care of yourself, Duchess," he'd said as he left, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Blackwood can be a challenging place. It sounded less like a pleasantry and more like a warning. My new, tentative peace gave me the courage to explore the manor more thoroughly. I was no longer an intruder, but the lady of the house, and I began to assert myself in small ways. I rearranged the flowers, consulted with the cook on menus, and even dared to move a small, uncomfortable settee from the morning room. Mrs. Gable watched my every move with hawk-like disapproval, but Alistair said nothing, his silence a form of permission. It was during this period of exploration that I found the West Wing, a section of the house that seemed perpetually shrouded in dust sheets. One room, at the very end of the corridor, was locked. "What is this room?" I asked Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper's lips pursed. "That was the late Duchess's boudoir, Your Grace. His Grace had it locked after her death. No one is permitted to enter." Another shrine. But my curiosity was piqued. This wasn't just a public space filled with her portraits. This was her private sanctuary. What secrets did it hold? The key, I discovered, was not hidden. It was on Alistair's own keychain, which he often left on the hall table when he returned from riding. One afternoon, when he was meeting with his steward and the entire household was occupied, I felt a compulsion I couldn't explain. My fingers trembled as I lifted the heavy iron key from the ring. It felt like a monumental transgression. The lock turned with a rusty groan. The air that hit me from inside the room was stale, thick with the scent of dried roses and dust. It was a beautiful room, decorated in shades of lavender and cream. A silver-backed brush set, engraved with the initial I, lay on the dressing table. A book of poetry lay open on a chaise lounge, a silk ribbon marking a page. It was as if its occupant had just stepped out for a moment, not departed this world 2 years ago. But I was not looking for ghosts. I was looking for a person. I felt like an archaeologist, piecing together the life of a woman everyone worshipped, but no one seemed to truly describe. On her writing desk, a beautifully inlaid piece of rosewood, sat a locked leather correspondence box. This felt like a deeper violation, but I couldn't stop. I tested the lock. It was secure. I searched the desk drawers, finding only fine stationery and sealing wax. Where would a woman hide a small, precious key? Not in a place of logic, but a place of heart. My eyes fell upon the book of poetry. I picked it up. It was Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The ribbon marked a passionate sonnet. Tucked deep within the book's spine, I found it. A tiny, ornate silver key. My heart pounded as I fitted the key into the lock of the correspondence box. It clicked open. Inside, there was not the trove of romantic letters from Alistair that I might have expected. Instead, there was a small, leather-bound diary and a bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. The letters were not from the Duke. The handwriting was a flamboyant, masculine scrawl, and they were signed simply, "Your Julian." My blood turned to ice. Julian Croft. I sat down, my legs suddenly weak, and opened the first letter. The date was from 3 years ago, a year before her death. "My dearest Bella," it began. "This gilded cage you call a marriage is a crime against nature. Blackwood is a tomb, and your Duke is its cold, unfeeling warden. He may possess your hand, but you know as I do, that your heart, your fiery, magnificent heart, has always been mine." I read on, my horror growing with every line. Letter after letter painted a picture not of a cherished duchess, but of an unhappy, trapped woman. Julian wrote of their shared past, of secret meetings before her marriage, of a passion he claimed Alistair could never match. He belittled the Duke, calling him possessive, dull, a man obsessed with duty and lineage who could never appreciate her spirit. He gives you jewels and a title, another letter read, "But I am the only one who has ever seen your soul. Flee with me, my love. We can go to Italy, to France, anywhere he will never find us. Leave the children. They are Beaumont's. He will care for them. It is your life, your happiness, we must fight for." I dropped the letters as if they were burning coals. This was poison, a calculated campaign to undermine a marriage, to prey on a woman's insecurities. Then I picked up the diary. Her handwriting was a delicate, precise script, a stark contrast to Julian's scrawl. The entries were sporadic, filled with a profound melancholy. 14th. Alistair brought me the Blackwood diamonds today. They are magnificent, but so cold. He looks at me sometimes as if I am another one of his possessions, the prized jewel in his collection. He speaks of legacy, of heirs, of duty. Does he ever see me? November 3rd. Julian writes again. His letters are a window to another world, a life I might have had. He understands my restlessness. Alistair mistakes my spirit for frivolity. He wishes to tame me, to make me into his perfect, placid duchess. The weight of his expectations is crushing. January 10th. I am with child again. Alistair is overjoyed. Another heir for the great house of Blackwood. I feel only a profound weariness. Ilara looks at me with his serious eyes. I feel I am failing her. I cannot be the mother she needs, this serene Madonna of the manor. There is a storm inside me, and I am so utterly alone. My hands were shaking. This was not the story I had been told. Isabella was not a saint. She was a complicated, lonely, and deeply unhappy woman, caught between a demanding, emotionally reserved husband and a manipulative, dangerously charming cousin. Alistair's grief, was it for the woman she was, or for the perfect wife he had tried to mold her into? He wasn't mourning a person. He was mourning the collapse of his perfect world, the shattering of his legacy. He hadn't loved Isabella for her fire and lightning, as Julian had called it. He had sought to extinguish it. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Panicked, I shoved the letters and diary back into the box, locked it, and slid the key back into the poetry book. I scurried out of the room, locking the door behind me, just as a maid came around the corner. She gave me a curious look, but said nothing. I returned the Duke's key to the hall table, my heart still racing. The knowledge I now possessed was a heavy, dangerous burden. The ghost of Isabella was no longer a perfect, intimidating spectre. She was a tragic, flawed woman, a victim of the two men who had claimed to love her. And I, the unwanted replacement, was the only one who now knew the truth. The discovery in Isabella's boudoir changed everything. When I looked at Alistair, I no longer saw just a grieving widower, but a man blinded by his own rigid ideals. His devotion to Isabella's memory was not an act of pure love, but one of profound, guilt-ridden pride. He was preserving the image of the perfect life he had failed to build. The silent halls of Blackwood were not a monument to her, but to his failure. This new understanding gave me a strange sense of confidence. I was no longer competing with a ghost. I was dealing with the legacy of a real, flawed woman. I began to make more significant changes around the house. I let sunlight into the perpetually dim drawing room. I filled the vases with bright, cheerful flowers instead of funereal white lilies, and I even started playing the pianoforte. Simple, light-hearted melodies that chased the oppressive silence from the corners of the rooms. Mrs. Gable looked scandalized, but Alistair, to my surprise, seemed less burdened. Sometimes I would catch him listening from the doorway of his study, a look of profound contemplation on his face. My relationship with the children continued to improve. Thomas was my devoted companion. With Ilara, I adopted a new strategy. I stopped trying to be a mother and instead became an ally. I listened to her lessons, praised her exquisite drawings, and asked for her opinion on matters of the garden. The late Duchess preferred white roses, she informed me stiffly one afternoon, as we stood by the overgrown plot. I know, I replied gently, but white roses can be so lonely. I thought perhaps some vibrant reds, and maybe some yellow for cheerfulness, would make them feel less alone. What do you think? She considered this with the gravity of a field marshal. Perhaps a blush pink, she conceded. Mamma liked blush pink. It was a victory as significant as any treaty. The peace, however, was destined to be shattered. A month later, a carriage once again rolled up the gravel drive, and out stepped Lord Julian Croft. This time he was not here to mourn. His smile was predatory, his eyes holding a new, triumphant gleam. He had come on the pretext of business with Alistair, but his true target, I knew, was me. He found me in the library. "Duchess," he said, his voice a silky purr, "you are looking radiant. It seems country life agrees with you. You have brought a warmth to this old place." Isabella was never quite able to manage that. The casual way he dropped her name, the subtle criticism veiled as a compliment, sent a chill down my spine. "I am glad you find the house welcoming, Lord Croft," I said, my voice level. His smile widened. "Oh, I do. But I wonder, does its master? Or is he still worshipping at the shrine of a saint who was, shall we say, less than saintly?" My heart stopped. He knew. He must have known about the letters, or suspected I would find them. "I don't know what you mean," I said, turning back to my book, my hands trembling. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't you? A woman as intelligent as yourself, living in the shadow of a martyr? You must have questions. You must have wondered what she was really like." He leaned against the bookshelf, feigning nonchalance. "She was miserable, you know. Utterly, tragically miserable. Alistair, with his endless talk of duty and decorum, was suffocating her. I was her only escape." "That is a cruel thing to say about the dead," I retorted, my voice sharp. "The truth is often cruel, my dear Annelise," he said, using my given name for the first time. It felt like a violation. But it can also be a powerful weapon, a man like Alistair. His entire world is built on honor, on the pristine image of his family. Imagine what would happen if the world were to learn that his perfect Duchess was planning to leave him. That she found him so cold, so insufferable, that she was willing to abandon her own children to escape him. I felt sick. This was his plan. He wasn't just a manipulative seducer, he was a blackmailer. "What do you want, Julian?" I demanded. "Want?" He feigned surprise. "I simply want justice for my Bella. Her memory has been twisted into something she was not, and perhaps a little compensation for my silence. Alistair has a great deal of money. Money he denied her. A few of his more lucrative investments, signed over to me, would ensure the tragic tale of the unhappy Duchess remains our little secret. He was a vulture, picking at the bones of a tragedy he had helped create. And if I refuse to help you?" His eyes hardened. "Then I will have no choice but to enlighten him myself. I will show him copies of her letters to me, letters in which she begs me to take her away. I will tell him how you have systematically tried to erase her memory from this house. He will see you as a usurper, a schemer who desecrated his wife's memory. His fragile trust in you will shatter. He will despise you more than he did on your wedding day. He will send you away, and I will have what I want regardless. He had me trapped. If I told Alistair, Julian would twist it, making me the villain. If I kept silent, I was complicit in his vile scheme." He saw the panic in my eyes and smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of his lips. "I will give you until the end of the week to persuade him," he said, straightening his coat. "Think of it as a way of securing your own position, Duchess. Once he is free of his ghost, perhaps he will finally have room for you." He left me standing there, the silence of the library pressing in on me. He hadn't just discovered a secret. He had weaponized Isabella's memory, turning her private pain into a tool for extortion. And he was aiming it directly at the fragile heart of my new life. For 3 days, I lived in a state of quiet terror. Julian was a constant, unnerving presence in the house, his charming facade a mask for the poison that lay beneath. He was patient, giving me a knowing, conspiratorial smile whenever our paths crossed, a silent reminder of the guillotine he held over my head. I could barely eat or sleep. The thought of his vile plan, of Alistair's world being torn apart by such calculated cruelty, was a physical weight on my chest. I knew I could not be Julian's accomplice, but his threat was potent. He was right. If he presented the letters to Alistair, he would paint me as a villain who had snooped through the belongings of the dead. All the fragile progress I had made would be undone. Alistair's grief would curdle into a renewed, bitter resentment, and I would be cast out. On the 3rd night, I made my decision. I would rather be banished with my integrity intact than remain the Duchess of Blackwood through deceit and blackmail. I had to tell Alistair the truth, whatever the consequences. I found him in his study after dinner. The room was his sanctuary, panelled in dark wood and smelling of leather and old paper. He was standing by the fireplace, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. He looked impossibly weary. "Alistair," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Annelise, is something wrong?" "We need to talk," I said, my hands clenched at my sides. "It is about Lord Croft, and about Isabella." His name for her. The air in the room instantly grew colder. His posture stiffened, the wall of grief slamming back into place. "What about them?" Before I could continue, the study door opened without a knock. Julian strolled in, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Ah, here you both are. Perfect timing. I was just looking for you, Alistair. I have a matter of some delicacy to discuss." He had followed me. He knew I was going to defy him. "What is it, Julian?" Alistair asked, his voice clipped with annoyance. "It seems your new Duchess has been doing some exploring," Julian began, his eyes fixed on me. "She has found her way into my dear cousin's private chambers, a place you yourself have kept sealed, out of respect." Alistair's stormy gaze snapped to me. The trust that had been slowly building between us vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury and betrayal. "Is this true?" I couldn't speak. I could only nod, my heart sinking. Julian pressed his advantage. "She has been reading Isabella's private things, and in her meddling she has, I'm afraid, uncovered something you ought to know. It is painful, Alistair, but it is for the best." He produced a small packet of letters from his coat pocket. "These are copies of letters Isabella wrote to me, letters in which she confessed the depths of her unhappiness in this marriage. She saw you not as a husband, but as a jailer." He began to read from one, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "He does not love me, Julian. He loves the idea of me, the Duchess who will give him heirs and manage his house. My spirit is dying here." Alistair stood as if turned to stone, his face pale, his knuckles white around his glass. "She planned to leave you," Julian continued relentlessly. "She was going to come with me, to Italy. We were to start a new life. She begged me to take her away from you, from this cold, loveless prison." He looked at me, his eyes glinting with malice. "And your new wife, in her eagerness to expunge Isabella's memory, found evidence of this. She came to me, not to you. She sought to use this information to secure her own place here." That's a lie. I finally found my voice, tears stinging my eyes. He is the one who came to me. He is trying to blackmail you. Alistair looked from Julian's smug face to my frantic one. His own was a mask of agony and confusion. He was a man whose entire world was crumbling. He wants your investments, Alistair, I pleaded. He threatened to reveal this if I did not help him convince you to sign them over. He is using her memory, her pain, to enrich himself. Such hysterics, Julian scoffed. Look at her, Alistair, a desperate woman from a bankrupt family. Who are you going to believe? Your wife's cousin, or the woman who bought her title and invaded your late wife's most private sanctuary? It was then that something inside me broke. It was not fear, but a surge of pure, unadulterated anger. Anger for Isabella, a woman trapped between these two selfish men. Anger for Alistair, who was being so cruelly manipulated. Anger for myself, for being a pawn in this horrible game. I walked to the desk, my movements steady and deliberate. I opened the top drawer, where I had placed Isabella's diary that very afternoon, having retrieved it from her room. I had brought it here, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. I held it out to Alistair. You do not have to believe me, or him, I said, my voice shaking but clear. Believe her. Read what she wrote. Not in letters to a man who sought to poison her against you, but in her own private words, for her eyes only. Alistair stared at the small leather book as if it were a serpent. Read it, I urged, my gaze locked on his. Read about her loneliness. Read about the pressure you put on her to be the perfect duchess. Read about how you gave her jewels but never saw her soul. Julian is a viper, yes, but he did not create her unhappiness. He only fed on it. You both failed her. You, by trying to cage her spirit, and he, by trying to steal it for himself. Julian's face went white with fury. This is nonsense. She is twisting her words. But Alistair wasn't looking at Julian. He was looking at me. In my eyes, he saw not the deceit Julian had claimed, but a raw, painful honesty. He slowly took the diary from my hand. His fingers brushed mine, and for the first time, his touch was not cold, but hesitant and warm. He opened the book. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ragged sound of my own breathing. He read page after page, his expression shifting from disbelief to anguish, and finally, to a profound, devastating understanding. The myth of his perfect marriage, the foundation of his 2-year-long grief, was unraveling before his very eyes. Alistair looked up from the diary, his eyes, so often stormy and distant, now clear with a terrible, shattering clarity. He looked not at Julian, but through him, as if he were an insignificant ghost. You, Alistair said, his voice low and guttural, filled with a controlled rage that was far more terrifying than any shout. You preyed on my wife's loneliness. You filled her head with poison, not out of love for her, but out of envy for me. You saw her not as a woman to be cherished, but as a prize to be stolen. He took a step forward. She was not perfect, and I was a fool, a proud, blind fool. I loved her, but I did not know how to love her. I tried to fit a star into a neat little box. I saw her spirit, and instead of celebrating it, I tried to tame it. My guilt over that, my failure, is what has been haunting this house. He finally turned his gaze on Julian, his eyes blazing. But you are not a mourner. You are a carrion crow. Get out of my house, and if you ever dare to speak her name, or my wife's name, again, I will personally see to it that every door in London is closed to you. I will ruin you. Julian, stripped of his power, sputtered, his charming facade crumbling to reveal the pathetic, greedy man beneath. He shot me a look of pure hatred before turning and all but fleeing from the room. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving Alistair and me in the echoing silence. The confrontation was over, but the wreckage lay all around us. Alistair sank into a chair, the diary still open in his hands. His shoulders slumped, not with grief, but with the crushing weight of truth. "All this time," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "I have been mourning an idea. A portrait. Not the real woman. The unhappy, struggling woman who needed me to see her." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion I had never seen before. "And you saw her. You defended her, even when it meant risking everything." I walked over to him, my anger gone, replaced by a wave of empathy for this broken, humbled man. I knelt before his chair. "I did not do it to win your favor, Alistair," I said softly. "I did it because she deserved to be seen as she was. Not a saint, not a sinner, just a woman. Trapped." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, before he gently brushed a tear from my cheek. His touch was electric, a spark of genuine connection in the ruins of the past. "I have been a terrible husband to you, Annelise. I bound you in a contract and then shackled you to a ghost. I brought you into a house of sorrow and expected you to navigate it alone. I have been blind to your strength, your kindness, your grace." He set the diary aside and took both of my hands in his. "My love didn't die with Isabella. What died was my pride, my youthful, arrogant certainty of what love should be. I have been so lost in the past that I failed to see the incredible woman who was my future." He stood, pulling me to my feet. We stood facing each other, the space between us no longer a chasm of grief, but charged with a new, fragile possibility. "Can you forgive me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Can we begin again?" Tears streamed down my face, but they were tears of relief, of hope. "There is nothing to forgive," I whispered. "We were both strangers, bound by circumstance, but we do not have to be strangers anymore." He leaned in and kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet, but one of profound tenderness and gratitude. It was a promise. It was a beginning. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows of Blackwood Manor seemed brighter. The portraits on the walls seemed less stern. The house felt lighter, as if it had finally exhaled a breath it had been holding for 2 long years. Alistair took me to Isabella's locked boudoir. Together we packed away her things, not as an erasure, but as a tender farewell. We would keep her memory alive for her children, but we would tell them the truth of a beautiful, spirited woman who was loved, but also sad. Later that week, Alistair took me to the small, private chapel on the estate. It was just the 2 of us, standing before the simple stone altar. Elara and Thomas were outside, their happy laughter drifting in through the open door as they chased butterflies in the sun. Alistair clasped my hand. His touch was warm, firm and steady. He looked into my eyes, his own clear and full of a love that was real, present, and directed solely at me. "Lady Annelise Beaumont," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity in the quiet chapel. "My wife, my love, my Duchess. I stand with you now, not to fulfill a contract, but to make a vow. My heart is yours. My life is yours. Let us build our future here, together." I smiled through my tears, my heart so full I thought it might burst. "Alistair," I replied, my hand tightening in his. "My husband, my love. Yes, let us begin." And so, a marriage that began with a devastating whisper at the altar was reborn in the quiet truth of a country chapel. Annelise and Alistair's story reminds us that love isn't always a fairy tale beginning. Sometimes it's a difficult, painful journey of dismantling the ghosts of the past to build a future. It's about having the courage to see people for who they truly are, flaws and all, and loving them not in spite of their imperfections, but because of them. Theirs was not a story of replacing a lost love, but of discovering a new one, stronger and more resilient for having grown in the broken ground of sorrow. If their journey from heartbreak to healing touched your heart, please show your support by giving this video a like. Share it with someone who loves a story of redemption and second chances. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the dramatic, emotional, and unforgettable stories from history. Thank you for listening.